In 1863, a delegation arrived at a castle on the Adriatic Sea carrying a document. They told the Austrian archduke inside that it was a petition from the Mexican people, begging him to become their emperor. It wasn't. It was written by exiles, arranged by the French, and backed by an army that wouldn't stay long enough to protect him. His name was Ferdinand Maximilian von Habsburg, and he wanted to believe it so badly that he never asked the one question that would have saved his life. Who actually signed this? And why does it sound so convenient for the men holding the guns? 4 years later, he'd be standing in front of a firing squad in a country that had never voted for him, paying with his life for a crown that was never really his to accept. Maximilian was born in 1832, the younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria. In the Habsburg family, being the younger brother meant something specific. You got the title, the palaces, the education, and none of the actual power. He spent his 20s watching his older brother make every decision that mattered, while he collected ceremonial posts that looked important and controlled almost nothing. He built himself a career instead. He became a rear admiral in the Austrian Navy, cultivated an interest in botany and travel writing, and married Charlotte of Belgium, daughter of King Leopold I, in 1857. Everyone called her Carlota. Vienna gave him a real job once, as Viceroy of Lombardy-Venetia in northern Italy. He tried to govern with a lighter hand than his brother's court wanted, easing censorship and courting local elites instead of simply ruling by decree. It didn't take. Vienna saw leniency where he saw strategy, and he was recalled within 2 years, restless and underused all over again. 3,000 miles away, Mexico was drowning in debt. Decades of civil war between liberals and conservatives, known as the Reform War, had gutted the treasury and left the government's credit in ruins. And in 1861, President Benito Juarez did the one thing a bankrupt government does. He suspended payments on everything Mexico owed to foreign lenders. Britain, Spain, and France responded together, sending warships to Veracruz to collect by force what Juarez wouldn't pay voluntarily. It looked, at first, like a straightforward debt collection mission. For 2 of the 3 powers, it was. Britain and Spain got their assurances and went home, satisfied that the debt collection mission had done its job. France did not. Napoleon III had a much bigger idea, and the unpaid debt was only ever the excuse that got his soldiers through the door. He wanted a foothold in the Americas that answered to Paris, access to Mexican silver, new markets for French goods, and a friendly monarchy that would quietly check the growing power of the United States next door. A Catholic empire in Mexico, loyal to France, was worth far more to him than a debt repayment ever could be. A group of Mexican conservative exiles, furious at Juarez's anti-clerical reforms and the seizure of church property, had been in Paris for years lobbying for exactly this. Napoleon III listened. Between his ambitions and their grievances, an emperor was about to be manufactured out of nothing. Conveniently for everyone in that Paris drawing room, there was a young Habsburg archduke sitting idle at Miramare Castle, Catholic, aristocratic, and visibly hungry for a throne of his own. Maximilian was, to Napoleon III, a solution looking for a problem. But first, France had to actually win Mexico, crown or no crown. On May the 5th, 1862, a French army considered among the finest in the world marched on the city of Puebla expecting an easy victory over a poorly equipped Mexican force. They didn't get one. General Ignacio Zaragoza's outnumbered defenders routed the French at Puebla in a humiliating defeat that is still celebrated today as Cinco de Mayo, a Mexican holiday born from beating back the very empire that was about to be forced on the country. Puebla cost Napoleon III a year and a great deal of pride. He sent thousands more reinforcements rather than accept the defeat as final. By 1863, a much larger French army returned, took Puebla, and marched into Mexico City itself, unopposed. With the capital under French occupation, the machinery of legitimacy could finally be staged. A hand-picked assembly of Mexican notables convened and, exactly as scripted, formally offered the imperial crown of Mexico to Maximilian of Habsburg. This was the invitation delivered to Miramare. Not a national vote, not a popular movement. A gathering of hand-picked conservatives in a city under French military occupation, producing the outcome the occupying army wanted. Maximilian and Carlota chose to believe it was the voice of a grateful nation. It was a performance staged for an audience of 2. In May 1864, Maximilian and Carlota sailed for Mexico and settled into Chapultepec Castle overlooking Mexico City. an emperor and empress of a country most of their new subjects had never asked them to rule, greeted by curated crowds arranged for exactly that impression. To Napoleon III's visible irritation, Maximilian tried to actually govern like a liberal, taking the will of the people story he'd been sold seriously enough to act on it. He kept parts of Juarez's reforms in place and refused to fully restore seized church lands, hoping to win over moderates on both sides. It satisfied almost no one. The conservatives who'd wanted their old clerical order back felt betrayed by his moderation. Juarez's Republicans, meanwhile, never recognized him as anything but a foreign puppet and kept fighting from exile as a government that refused to disappear. Maximilian genuinely seemed to believe he could rule as a benevolent, popular monarch above the fighting, a ruler both sides could eventually accept. Almost every person around him could see what he could not. That belief only worked as long as French bayonets stood behind him. He signed decrees, held court, planned botanical gardens, and behaved in every visible way, like a man secure on his throne. Security, in his case, wasn't coming from any Mexican institution. It was rented, and the rent was due in French soldiers. Here's the part Maximilian never fully reckoned with. His entire empire existed because a foreign army was occupying his new country. Take away that army, and there was no throne left to sit on. Only a very well-dressed man alone in a castle full of enemies. The bill came due sooner than anyone in Chapultepec expected. Across the border, the American Civil War had consumed Washington's attention for years, leaving little room to challenge the French intervention directly, even though the United States never recognized Maximilian's government for a single day, treating it as an occupation dressed up in a crown. Then, in April 1865, the Civil War ended. The United States suddenly had a battle-hardened army, a firm policy called the Monroe Doctrine, and zero patience for a French-installed monarchy sitting on its southern border. American diplomats leaned on Napoleon III directly, invoking the Monroe Doctrine's warning against European powers meddling in the hemisphere, and American guns began flowing to Juarez's Republican forces. The math around Maximilian's throne had just changed completely, and not in his favor. Napoleon III did the calculation Maximilian never fully allowed himself to do. A costly, unpopular war in Mexico, rising Prussian ambition back in Europe, and mounting American pressure all pointed to the same conclusion: cut losses and cut them now. Through 1866, French troops began withdrawing from Mexico in stages. The empire Napoleon III had built for his own convenience was about to be quietly dismantled for the exact same reason. By March 1867, the last French soldiers boarded ships and left. Napoleon III had gotten everything he wanted out of the arrangement and simply walked away from the man he'd talked into the crown. Maximilian was informed, essentially, that the empire was over. He was still expected to be its emperor. Carlota refused to accept it quietly. In 1866, as the withdrawal became undeniable, she boarded a ship for Europe to beg for help in person, leaving Maximilian behind in Mexico and certain that the right conversation with the right man could still save everything. She went first to Napoleon III himself in Paris, pleading face-to-face for France to honor its commitment. He turned her away. The empire he'd built was no longer worth the cost to him, and no amount of pleading changed that arithmetic. Desperate, she traveled on to Rome to appeal directly to the Pope, hoping the Church might pressure France or rally Catholic support where diplomacy had failed. That failed too, completely and finally, leaving her with nowhere left to turn and no one left to ask. Somewhere in the wreckage of those refusals, Carlota's mind broke. She became gripped by paranoid delusions, convinced at times that she was being poisoned by the very people around her trying to help. She never returned to Mexico. She never saw her husband again. Carlota lived the next 60 years of her life in seclusion in Europe, mourning an empire and a marriage that had both collapsed at almost exactly the same moment. Back in Mexico, nearly everyone who cared about Maximilian told him the same thing: leave with the French, go home to Austria, live. Foreign diplomats offered him safe passage on ships already waiting in Veracruz harbor. He refused. Instead, he stayed and rode north to Querétaro with two loyal generals, Miguel Miramare and Tomas Mejia, to make a stand for a throne that had already, functionally, ceased to exist. Juarez's forces surrounded the city for weeks, cutting off supplies and reinforcements. One of Maximilian's own officers betrayed the defenses from within, and in May 1867, after a grinding siege, the man who had once been handed an empire by strangers in Paris was taken prisoner by the country he'd tried to rule. Pleas for his life poured in from around the world. Victor Hugo wrote in his defense. Giuseppe Garibaldi appealed for clemency. European monarchs sent letters begging Juarez to spare a fellow sovereign. Juarez refused every single one of them. He needed the world to see, unmistakably, that no foreign power could install a monarch in Mexico and expect it to stand. On June 19, 1867, Maximilian faced a firing squad at the Cerro de las Campanas alongside Miramare and Mejia. He reportedly handed his executioners gold coins and asked them to aim for his chest, not his face, so his mother could still recognize him. Within weeks, the empire he'd believed a nation had begged him to accept was simply gone, dissolved the moment the man wearing its crown stopped breathing. Final proof that it had never belonged to him, or existed, at all outside of what one flattering delegation and one very willing archduke had agreed to pretend.